Go on and start this very excellent and exciting event on quick action, fast actions on near-term climate mitigation to protect both air quality and achieve the Paris climate goals. And first, before starting and giving the floor over to the excellent speakers, I wanted to thank the sponsors of this event, which includes the Veolia Institute, the IGSD, you are all here in the room, I hope, and IASS Potsdam. It's under the umbrella of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and we are here to help implement the already ratified Paris Agreement. So there is no time to waste now. And I don't want to spend any time of yours, but we'll pass over to the opening remarks from our moderator, Professor Mark Lawrence. He's the Managing Scientific Director of the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, IASS, in Potsdam. And IASS is also, together with IGSD on my left here, part of the CCAC steering committee, in addition to helping us to sponsor this event. So I just also wanted to mention to you that we have many speakers on the agenda. We are going to focus on the action-oriented, how to do things on scaling up action. We're going to have some political impetus of how to build political will around these issues from California, and they are out there booing the fossil fuel industry, I hear. And then we will have a session on how do we finance this, both from a national perspective and an international perspective. So over to Mark Lawrence, who will also help us to launch a couple of exciting reports. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Helena, very much, and welcome all to our side event. It's great to see you here. We are competing indeed with the Fossil of the Day Award, but hopefully we can show some ways so that we won't have to give Fossils of the Day awards in the future, and hopefully even in the near future. We're talking about near-term climate change mitigation options. So what I'm going to do is give you a very brief background reminder of where we stand on the science and the policy, and then pass that on to two of our colleagues who have led a task force putting together a new report that's out this week, and you'll hear more about that as we go along. So I don't have to talk long about the science. You know all about that from the thousands of pages that are published in the IPCC reports. And you know then very much about the political side of this from these negotiations, which very often have a demeanor that looks something like this. Every once in a while, that changes, as it did last year. And we had the great euphoria of coming to an agreement, the Paris Agreement. And that enthusiasm and that excitement has continued on, with the Paris Agreement already entering into force, and with over 100 nations already signing, ratifying the Paris Agreement. But of course, this euphoria is beginning to fade into one big question, which is the question of how. How in the world do we design and implement the societal transformations at all levels, from the largest systemic levels down to the individual choices that we make in order to make this possible? Well, there's been a lot of science on that already, as you're also familiar with in all likelihood. For instance, the representative concentration pathways that were developed for the last IPCC, which show us different self-consistent socioeconomic pathways of carbon dioxide emissions throughout the rest of the century, and then what kinds of temperatures at the end of the century this would imply. We're currently somewhere on a pathway between the red, way up here, and the gray in the middle, which would put us way outside of the range of 2 degrees global warming. If we want to have any hopes of staying below 2 degrees global warming, let alone 1.5 degrees, we would have to be on the blue pathways down here, which would require complete decarbonization by 2050, a complete transformation into renewable energy, changing our mobility habits, changing our agricultural systems, many other things along with that. And on top of that, to make it even more challenging, all of these scenarios include, almost all, 90% of these scenarios include removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And enough so that our emissions go net negative by 2070 or so in most of the scenarios. And what makes it even worse, what this sort of hides behind it, it's not being hidden, but it's hard to see unless you know it, is that that implies gross negative emissions by 2020 already. And most of the scenarios assume we'll be taking several gigatons of carbon dioxide per year out of the atmosphere by 2030, with technologies that aren't even developed and with implications on the large scale that we have really no idea of. So this is a very, very challenging step that we need to go through, and add to that the fact that it's not only carbon dioxide. We also have to consider the short-lived climate-forcing pollutants, the SLCPs, which are responsible for about half of current global warming. But while this adds a challenge, this also adds a promise, because these are removed from the atmosphere quickly. When we stop emitting them, they disappear relatively quickly within days to decades. And they give us a potential for a rapid reduction in global warming of more than 0.5 degrees C, current estimate of 0.6 degrees. And of course, there are vast co-benefits providing emphasis and providing further motivation for this for health, agriculture, and quality of life. So today, in the next two talks, you're going to hear about a new report that we've put together, which is available on the IGSD website, which talks about various stages, building blocks, and levers towards how we could actually go about making this happen. We'll first have a video that's been recorded by one of the report chairs, Ramanathan, and then Durwood Zaelke will tell us some more about the report and give us a segue into the policy aspects and the policy steps that can be taken. So with that, off to the video from Ramanathan.
Today, we are releasing a high-level policy summary to get your response before we finalize this. So we are using Marrakesh to get feedback on this report from the public and civil societies to see how we should further proceed with this. So the report was written by a committee of 30. They cover a wide range of discipline from natural sciences, social sciences, and from the civil society as well. And we have also the military and diplomats from India and the countries like US and China, EU countries are represented in this report. We also have some former environmental ministers. So it's a really a broad array of people got together. And so I'm just going to talk to you about basically what are we really attempting here. We're starting with the Paris Agreement as the fundamental building block and see how can we enhance it so that we can achieve the 2-degree goal of the Paris Agreement, okay? So we have covered policy actions, technology actions, and societal involvement in making this happen. So the first building block is the Paris Agreement, and the second is a series of sister agreements. It was a major accomplishment at Kigali, and we want to encourage the subnational and city-scale climate action plans. I think they're going to be crucial in making the Paris Agreement. What we are proposing here, to use this as building blocks and pull 3 levers. Okay, so the third building block is decarbonizing the economy, starting at 2020. Mind you, it's a major distinction. And then the second lever is pulling the lever on short-lived climate pollutants. There are 4 of them: methane, black carbon, ozone, and HFCs. I'm delighted to tell you the world at large has decided to pull on the HFCs. That alone would give us half a degree mitigation of warming. So let me just comment on that. The CO2, the Paris Agreement, if you follow the INDCs, the emission will still increase, but not as much, okay? But we want the emissions to start decreasing by 2020 to have any chance of keeping the warming under 2 degrees. So the thing is, if we are unable to do that, let's say we start bringing the emissions up by 2030, then we see the necessity for a third lever. Really, because by 2030, 35, if we don't decarbonize, we'd have added another 1 trillion tons of CO2. So we need a third lever directly extracting the carbon dioxide out of the air. So these are the targets, but how do you accomplish this? So the solution 1 is the targets. We see the solutions number 2 and 3, massive societal transformation so that we get public support for drastic actions. We're also calling for a coalition between science, policy, religion, and healthcare workers. We want proper governance. We want market mechanisms such as cap and trade and carbon pricing. And the 7 is, command and control. So these are all explained in the report. We are seeking your comment. Is there something we are missing? What do we have to add, etc.? So let me move on to what our next steps are. So this high-level summary is based on data we have collected. They are put into documents. Policymaker summary, about 30 pages. It'll go online. IGSD, the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, is the secretariat for this. And then there's a technical report. And I already said item number 2. The third is the finalized full summary consisting of high-level summary and the policymaker summary will be online after January 15th, when we think our first version is there. But the key thing is this is going to be an evolving document, okay, based on public comments and our own colleagues' comments. Thank you.
Okay. And what I'd like to point out is that we do have a simultaneous translation, interpretation available. So I'm not sure how to say that in Spanish for the people that speak Spanish and aren't understanding my English, but if you hear it better in the Spanish, there's interpretation back there and also in French. And so if you're interested, Wonderful. So Ramanathan pointed out that this report is open for comments. You can also get hard copies of the executive summary of the report available at the CCAC booth, which is on the other side of this hall. And now we're going to hear from Durwood Zaelke, who will tell us more about the report and especially the next steps into how we turn this into political action. Durwood.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning. The report does something unique before we get to the solutions. It talks about the need for speed because we are already at 1 degree and we are rapidly approaching the 1.5 degree mark. The problem of climate change is accelerating. And the best illustration of this is the self-reinforcing feedbacks, starting with the loss of sea ice in the Arctic. So between 1979 and 2011, we've lost so much of the Arctic sea ice and so much of the reflectivity that sends heat back into space that we've added warming that is 25% as much as the CO2 contribution in that period. Globally average, that's about 0.22 watts per square meter for those who know their metrics. But in the Arctic, it's 6.4 watts per square meter. That's twice the warming as all climate pollutants are putting into the system. That's why we have the Arctic amplification. It means the Arctic sea ice is reducing more and more every year, adding more and more warming. Another positive feedback is the northern migration of the permafrost line. As we warm the Arctic, we release more and more stored methane and CO2 from what used to be permanent frost. It's no longer permanent. It's melting and we're accelerating the problem. Between, the next slide, please. Between 1.5 degrees, which is part of the goal of Paris, we're aiming for 2 degrees, we don't exceed 2 degrees, but we're aiming for keeping warming below 1.5 degrees and climate neutrality, net zero emissions by mid-century. But if you look at this chart, you'll see that there is a cluster of 18 unique tipping points, including the Arctic sea ice, that we expect to see tripped between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So while we all say 2 degrees is going to be tough, we really need to aim for 1.5. Now, the next slide is a favorite of mine from Professor Ramanathan's work. It shows the probability distribution of temperature increases, and overlaid is a series of tipping points. And you see where we're going to be passing them all through this increased warming. But you look at the unique problem of the fat tail. It is possible, it's probably a 5%, 1 in 20 chance that we will see warming that's going to be 4, 6, maybe 8 degrees, and we will pass all of the tipping points. So that fat tail problem is not well characterized and certainly not well appreciated. Now you get to the solutions that Ram pointed out in his video presentation, and we talk about 3 levers. And the first one is, let's get rid of CO2, decarbonize. Mark Jacobson from Stanford, who's on our team, has a plan to make all 134 countries he's looked at and all 50 states in the United States carbon neutral by 2050 or earlier, 80% reduction of 80% clean energy by 2030, 100% by 2050. These are aggressive but possible plans. We need to do that. Mark mentioned the second lever, and that's the short-lived climate pollutants. And he correctly noted that the short-lived climate pollutants were about half of the warming we experience today. But more importantly, the solution part of the short-lived pollutants is much, much more than that. If you do the aggressive lever on CO2, you pull it back now as hard and fast as we can, that'd be about a 450 ppm scenario, you can avoid 0.1 degree of warming by 2050. But if you pull the short-lived climate pollutant lever back on HFCs, black carbon, methane, tropospheric ozone, you get 6 times more avoided warming, 0.6 degrees. And this is critical for slowing the positive feedbacks and avoiding the tipping points. Because if we lose this near-term gain, we're going to find that we're facing a problem that's much, much more difficult to solve. Now, we did have a big success last month in Kigali, Rwanda, where we passed the HFC amendment to the Montreal Protocol. This will phase down hydrofluorocarbons used primarily as refrigerants through a series of steps over the next 30 plus years, and we will avoid up to 0.5 degrees Celsius of warming. We are embarking on an aggressive effort to capture the energy efficiency gains that we can get in parallel with the switch of refrigerants. So if we make our air conditioners, for example, more efficient by a mere 30%, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory has calculated we can add another amount of climate mitigation that would double the benefit. This is just from room air conditioners. In a warming world, the world is buying more air conditioners. And already in India, for example, there's merely a 5% penetration of air conditioners in urban India, and they are using 50 to 60% of their electricity just for that 5%. So as they go to 100+%, they are going to need a lot more renewables, and we have to make sure that they're super efficient as they go forward. Now, the third lever that we put in is for carbon removal. And I think Mark was very clear that if we don't get our metrics exactly right in the first 2 levers, we're going to need a lot of carbon removal. And inevitably, we'll need some. We already have some. And it starts with the brilliant technology of photosynthesis. So we need to protect our forest, expand those forests, our wetlands, our grasslands. We have a great engine if we protect it to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. So the bottom line is that speed matters profoundly. You cannot solve a fast-moving problem like climate change with slow-moving solutions. And all indications here in Marrakesh are that the solutions are not moving fast enough, and certainly the negotiations this session are not. Now we will shift to a discussion of politics and money. Both of those are key for speed. But I just want to mention one more fact. One of the people on our team doing this report with the University of California, scientist and others, is a professor down at Scripps, Walter Monk. And while we were doing the report a couple of weeks ago, Walter celebrated his 99th birthday. He's been at Scripps for 77 years. And when some of the scientists during our discussion said, you know, Mark Jacobson's being a little bit aggressive when he says we can turn the world to clean energy on this time scale. And Walter said, be really careful about saying what we can't do, because I want to tell you that I remember that between Pearl Harbor and D-Day was a mere 3.5 years. And we changed the industrial production of the United States in a way that lasted from that time forward. So speed matters, and we can generate speed. We get the right political will. Ken is going to show us that. And we get the money from the bankers here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Durwood. Every time I listen to you, it makes me want to jump up and say, let's get started. What are we waiting for? Thank you very much for that very inspirational reminder of what's really behind this report, what we really need to be doing. So as I remind you, you can get this report through the IGSD website, or you can pick up a hard copy over at the CCAC booth over there. And through the IGSD Secretariat, if you would like to make any comments on it. We've currently released the high-level summary. We'll soon putting the longer summary for policymakers online. And in an unusual step, we've decided to open these up for public commentary. So if you'd like to make comments, then at present, we don't have a specific mechanism. Just simply through the IGSD Secretariat, we'll be collecting these and developing a mechanism as we go along with this. So I'd also like to mention that in addition to this, 2 other reports will be discussed today. We'll have one later that was released earlier this year, the Cost of Air Pollution report from the World Bank. And this week is the launch of the European Investment Bank's report on SLCPs. Quite fitting, and I'm so pleased we'll be able to talk about that later in this session as well. But for now, we're going to take the next step and understand, after these motivating and sometimes scary concerns of what we're coming up with the science, what is politics going to do for this? What kind of political support do we already have? And we're going to be hearing from Ken Alex, who's the director of the Governor Brown's Office of Planning and Research in California. And all of you know how avant-garde California is in terms of not only art, not only technology, but also in terms of environmental policy. Ken.
Well, thank you. Avant-garde. Well, California is many things. I suppose avant-garde might fit it as well. Dr. Ramanathan, who you heard do the introductory remarks and is really one of the world's leading experts on short-lived climate pollutants, teaches at UC San Diego. And he and Governor Brown have spent quite a number of hours talking together. And I will not surprise any of you who know Dr. Ramanathan, but he's been very persuasive with the governor. And the governor is quite convinced that we not only must act on climate change, and which the governor has been very much on record, but also that short-lived climate pollutants are a place to take aggressive action, and that in doing so, we can have actually an outsized impact on the overall set of problems. So as a result of that, California now has legislation that requires us by 2030 to reduce short-lived climate pollutants, methane by 40%, black carbon, which California has already reduced by 95%, to reduce it another 50%. And HFCs by 40% as well. All of that in the 2030 timeframe. In California, methane, over 50% of methane emissions come from the agricultural sector, primarily from dairy cattle. We believe that there are some very significant solutions that are not only solutions to capturing methane, but reusing methane in a way that helps replace other fossil fuels. So it is in fact the case that California is continuing on. It doesn't really matter to us what the federal situation is in terms of proceeding. And we think that it's going to be economically in our interest, that the future of the economy in California is about taking these measures. So hopefully we'll have a lot of support and others joining us as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's great to hear this kind of movement that's going on around the world, and it's supporting at the grassroots level the steps that we need to get towards the Paris Agreement. Next, we're going to be moving into the core of this side event, and we'll be hearing about various issues around financing the mitigation of short-lived climate-forcing pollutants. We'll first hear from Roland, telling us about reducing methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. And as I understand it, this may be one of the less challenging financing issues that we have. We'll hear what he has to say about it.
Okay, hi, good afternoon. I'll try to keep you all awake because it's death by PowerPoint. But I think this is one of the most hopeful stories in this whole climate agenda. And that's really what I want to share with you. Now, up until 7 years ago, I was the head of Shell's global LNG business, which is about 10% of Shell. So I actually know this story both inside and outside. So I think that's an important angle. In the run-up to COP21, the Veolia Institute last year organized a conference about methane in general. But today, I really want to focus on the oil and gas piece. And these were some of the recommendations from that. And one, which you don't hear often, is consider pricing methane separately. We always roll it into CO2. Is that the right answer? The other one was that actually the oil and gas industry where we can make rapid progress. And I think that's really one of the optimistic sides of this story, which I want to get into. And finally, our data is lousy. And also that's pretty easy to fix. What I want to focus on, as I said, is oil and gas. Now, it's made it on, you may have seen last year, The Economist published a main article entitled, enticingly, A Dirty Little Secret, which essentially undermines the case for gas as a clean fossil fuel, which you hear bandied about everywhere. And it can be clean, but actually you have to make it clean. And this shows that the emissions from fossil fuel, as far as we know, and they may be underestimated here, are about the same as the cows and the same as or in the same order of magnitude as the waste. So it is very, very substantial. I think you may need to click, I don't know if I can do this. Yes, it does. So this is a video that shows a set of gas tanks through an infrared camera and without an infrared camera. And it's the most graphic representation of what happens. You know, there's lots of methane leakages in the oil and gas industry that are simply invisible because these things are in the middle of nowhere. And this is a simple tool to see what happens. Now, countries report here to the UNFCCC how much methane they emit. They have to do this by law every year. But if you actually dig into those self-reported numbers, they're kind of weird. And this is a summary of the emissions intensity from various countries. Now, the United States, as I'll show later, is the only country where it's been comprehensively measured. All other countries use estimation methods. And is it really true that the Netherlands emits 35% less than the US? Is it really true that Uzbekistan emits 4 times as much as Turkmenistan? I think, simply looking at these numbers, gives you a pretty clear indication that there's a big effort to be made on doing some proper measurements. And it's not that hard, and it's been under the radar screen, and it's doable. As I mentioned, it's huge. Reducing methane from the oil and gas industry would be equivalent to 40% of the emissions from coal plants taken over 20 years. The amount of methane is the 7th biggest gas producer in the world. And the value, we probably lose about $30 billion worth of methane every year. So they're very big numbers. It's actually, and that makes it self-financing. It's actually a good thing to go after. Now, I mentioned that we have lousy data. The exception is in the United States because the Environmental Defense Fund, which is the EDF, it's not the French EDF, if anybody is from France around here, there's a US EDF, has catalyzed over the past couple of years a set of measurement campaigns, and this is our 24 of the 30 peer-reviewed papers that have come out of it. And this is the first time we have a comprehensive data set about where the leaks are. And, you know, quite simply, this is an exercise that needs to be repeated in Europe, and it needs to be repeated in a number of other places just to confirm that indeed we understand the numbers better and countries no longer report just spurious numbers. Now, the good news out of all of this is that this isn't rocket science. You know, as I mentioned, I was in the oil and gas industry. These are the source of the leakages, and we know it. And it's really simple stuff. It's valves that are properly closed. It's operation stuff. There is no R&D required. The solutions are available. They're well known to the industry. So it's a question of doing proper measurements and then simply fixing it. It's also cheap. In most cases, it pays for itself where you are able to sell the gas. Now, you know, there are places where gas is flared and there's no market. And sure, I mean, there are places where it's hard, but there's so many places where it's easy and profitable. And so this can be done. And, you know, as I said, you know, up to 7 years ago, I ran a very large gas business. And the good news about this was not on the radar screen. So it wasn't bad faith or some evil fossil fuel industry that was hiding something. It just wasn't known. This is data that's come out at this scale in the past couple of years. And so we have a relatively new problem that's also very fixable. So what are the lessons learned from the US studies? By the way, this is one of the things the EDF did, is put methane detectors on Google cars, which has the great advantage of giving you maps of methane leaks, which is rather cool. So the emissions are higher than we thought. They're actually lower than some NGOs thought. So, but they're quite a bit higher than the EPA reported, and the EPA estimates have now been partly adjusted. The other really big insight, and it was mentioned before, is this is a heavy tail distribution. And this actually explains why the industry underestimates its own emissions, because of course they do sample measurements, but then they assume it's a normal distribution, and then you underestimate the total. And the other good news bit of it is with heavy tail distributions, as you all know from black swans and so on, is it means that there is a small number of very big leaks. So it means that if you can find them, you fix the problem relatively rapidly. So again, fundamentally good news. And finally, that the reduction is particularly cost effective. Now, this is also on the radar screen of investors now. This is a report that came out last month that looks at specifically targeted investors, and Société Générale released earlier this year a report actually ranking gas producers in terms of the risk to investors from lousy gas methane emissions management. So it's making it onto the radar screen of investors. Last year, a big step. Again, you know, this is all really recent stuff. Last year, in the Three Amigos Summit, as it was called, the US, Canada, and Mexico agreed to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas industry by 45% by 2025. Our estimate is that this is very doable. And, you know, basically, you know, quite separate from whether Trump will dump this, but this is a target that's doable and ought to be taken over by the EU and by a number of other countries. This is a solution that's within reach. So in summary, the reason I mentioned that I'm actually excited about this is that we have something which, you know, many of these climate problems have been around for decades and they're really tough to solve, right? Let's not kid ourselves. But here we have one that has a couple of unique features. It's a problem that's been underestimated for a long time. The solutions are known and are incredibly simple. Half of the leaks can be fixed on the spot by a guy with a wrench. So, I mean, this is what we're talking. Some of them are harder, but quite a lot of it's actually really simple. They're cost effective, at least half of them are cost effective. Inevitably, you get into some tougher stuff, but there's lots of easy things to do. And self-financing, because if you capture the gas, you can sell it. And the other unique things is that, in the contrary to people who keep cattle herders around the world with methane from cattle, which is, you know, a big issue, but very hard to manage, here you have a very small number of very well capitalized actors that you can engage with, and you can do this. So this is, in this whole climate landscape, I think, you know, in that sense, I am really optimistic, something that you can get your arms around and you can engage a relatively small community in fixing. And CCAC is, the oil and gas methane program is one of the platforms that attempts to do this. But it's all very recent and really quite exciting and worth getting informed on and seeing how you can move this forward. So thank you very much for that.
Roland, wonderful. I asked Roland if he could do it in 9 minutes, so we'd have 1 minute for a question. So we do have a minute for a question, if you'd like. It was perfectly 9 minutes. Do we have any questions for Roland? Yes, out there. Speak loudly, please. I don't think we have running microphones.
You have a microphone running.
But you have to.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for auction that the data was lousy. I was wondering if you could be more specific what you were talking about. And also if you could say any sort of recent progress that's been made in the last year or so to implement these suggestions.
Yeah, so the data problem is, for years people speculated about this, and some NGOs said that as much as 8 or 10% of the gas was leaked in the chain, and industry typically said, well, it's less than 1%. So what the Environmental Defense Fund did is they catalyzed a project which it took $30 million, so it's not exactly a small project, but in partnership with industry and universities to go and measure. And it actually implies putting massive plastic tarps over fracking fields and with a pipe at the top, and it's very practical, and airplanes and detectors, and actually measuring how much is being leaked. So this is and this was done over the past 3 years. So this is the first time that there's a comprehensive end-to-end from the oil well all the way to the urban distribution set of data that's been built up. And so how do other countries report their numbers to the UNFCCC? They do it based on estimates that are typically several decades old. They assume that, per unit of gas produced, there's so much leaked. They multiply and send it off by email to the UN. And so there's a real change, is that now we know that that's the wrong method, and we need to go out and do more measurements. We don't need to measure every single country, because the reality, it's the same brand of valves that are used in every country. This is an incredibly homogeneous industry. So the US data, is probably pretty relevant to other places, but we ought to go check. So that's basically the data problem. And it doesn't mean that we should wait until we have better data before taking any action, because we know it's a biggish problem. And so the second part of your question, in terms of action, I think the most concrete one is the CCAC's oil and gas methane partnership, where there are now 8 gas companies, Total, BP, Statoil, Pemex, etc., who have measurement campaigns and inside of their assets, and report and share best practice, etc., in order to really move this forward. But it does take more action from regulators. The regulations in the US, as we heard from California, actually make a real difference. And it certainly requires, for example, the EU to step up. And why not mirror the 45%, right? I mean, you can study this for years, but that's a concrete action to take.
Okay, an excellent question. Thank you very much. Let's thank Roland again. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who will be Eduardo Bitran Colodro, the Secretary General of CORFO and the former Minister of Public Works in Chile. And he'll be telling us about financing SLCP mitigation projects.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first of all, CORFO is the Chilean development agency that had different arms. We work in innovation promotion, entrepreneurship development, financing. In guarantees every year, we grant $1.6 billion in loan guarantees every year, venture capital financing, business productivity overall, and technological capabilities of the economy and the country. And we have a very clear mission to promote sustainable development in our country. In fact, we have put together a framework to promote innovation with certain focus, and we have borrowed from Europe the concept of the fifth helix approach, where you have academia, business, state, civil society, and climate change and sustainability as a main driver for innovation. Then what are we doing and how we are doing it? And how is this related to the short-lived pollutants that are so important for the short-term term? Well, where do we focus? First of all, taking advantage of the north. Chile has the best radiation, solar radiation of the world. We have also in the same place, in the same area, the main metallic mining district of the world. If you take together Chile and Peru, copper, silver, gold, molybdenum, 60% of all the world investment in metallic mining will take place in that area. And you know that mining is one of the main source or areas that use, area of the economy that use diesel. And diesel is extremely important in black carbon emissions. Then our plan is very simple. And we have already committed $120 million in innovation to accomplish this. We as CORFO, in representation of the state of Chile. We have a program to reduce the cost of photovoltaic energy, taking into account the high UV radiation that we have in Chile. We are working to reach $20 of levelized cost by 2030. This means that we'll be in a unique position to produce solar hydrogen. We are now in a unique position to produce solar hydrogen. And we are working today with the world leaders in hybrid for the big trucks of the mining sector that use 6,000 liters per day of diesel to substitute 60% of this in a range of 5 to 10 years. And let me tell you that we have done the pre-feasibility studies, and the cost of hydrogen is lower than the current cost of diesel, one of the lowest price of diesel ever in the last 40 years. Then this is very good business and extraordinary for the short-term goal in terms of climate change initiatives. Second, circular economy. The big tires, we could turn it back into synthetic diesel. We are bending it. We burn this today. And then the remaining 40% will go into synthetic diesel. But together with this, we have there in the same place the best research of the world to produce lithium nitrate, which is the best energy storage for CSP technology. And we require 24 times 7 electricity. And all of the generation in that region is gas or coal, and we will replace that. Then, if electromobility develop, as we think it will develop, in year 2035, we are going to have 20 million cars, electrical cars in the world, that will need 60 additional kilos of copper, and this consumer will ask for a clean copper. And our strategy is to differentiate our copper to get clean copper. And that's where the money is going. First initiative. That's the solar mining initiative that I was talking now. Second, I was said before, cattle production, very important. It's the main source of methane emission today. And we are working with the president yesterday of Chile announced the creation of the Climate Change Sustainable Agency of Chile, which is an existing agency of CORFO that had a very narrow focus on clean production. And we expand that to climate change. We have 17 years of working with medium-sized and small business in clean production. But now we add clean production plus energy efficiency plus distributed and renewable energy generation. Taking that together, we have worked with 6,000 companies already. We have the capability, bringing this broader view, we are able to do incredible things. Before, you work with pork's waste just to control the odor. But now we work to produce electricity and to take care of the methane emission, accomplishing two goals, local and global, and making efficient, more productive the production. Then this is one of the areas that we are working. We have developed wonderful instrument. We have venture capital fund named Waste to Energy. That is the main investor today in solutions for the pork industry to generate electricity from the emissions. And this is good business. We co-finance 2-to-1 this venture capital fund. Then the rest of the farming sector, fertilizers, a very important emitter of methane. We are working, we have 2 pilot projects in solar intelligent fruit production, which is Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things applied to the control of water consumption, fertilizers, and chemicals. And that create a new fruit. We export 50% of the world fruit of season, 50%. And that's our goal is should come with water trade, carbon trade, methane trade, certification. Finally, let me mention 2 things. Dendro energy. One of the worst problems for black carbon that we have in Chile, and also affecting the sinks because we are using illegal wood from the native forest. 4,000 people is dying prematurely every year because of this problem. There are 10 cities severely affected by the use of wet wood that you know is a very important source of black carbon. We are working in a program to turn into pellets. 2 years ago, we have 3 pellets plant. Today we have 80. And we're working with the Ministry of Environment, replacing the equipment to produce heating. And I'm trying now to work with the Ministry of Environment, instead of giving plain subsidies, to create financial instruments where we could leverage much more and solve the liquidity problem of the households through financial instruments. And we'll be able to accomplish our goal instead of 20 years in 5 years. Finally, construction and housing. This is the case of a radiata pine wood that is used to be exported to Vietnam. In Vietnam, they transform into panels, and in China, they produce houses. And we have compared the similar house in China and look at the emissions. That's CO2 emissions. But you know what else? The energy efficiency of this house is 30% higher. And that will prevent the use of wood in houses. And that will reduce also black carbon dramatically. Finally, to finish, AFC mitigation from cooling. we have been working with the same agency that is becoming now the Climate and Sustainable Agency of Chile, Climate Change and Sustainable Energy in Chile, in this collaborative partnership with retail to change their refrigerators in order to accomplish the AFC mitigation target. Chile signed the modification of the Montreal Agreement, and we are working in order to generate change. We are using guarantees, credit guarantees, to support financing of this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. What I especially liked there was the connection between what we often think on two completely different sides of different hemispheres, agriculture and technology, and how you're bringing the Internet of Things, the Industrial Revolution 4.0, into agriculture as well. It's fabulous to see these steps forward. So we're running a bit tight on time. If we have one short question and one short answer, we can still take those. Lara.
That's a missing link in this. The transportation sector in Chile is also an area that needs cleaning. Any comment?
Yeah. Well, you touch a hot topic because politics have not very well there. Because at some point in time, there was an initiative to reduce the tax on diesel for trucks. And at some point in time, diesel and gasoline taxes were more or less equivalent. And today, the tax is 1/4 of the gasoline tax, which is a major problem. And it's creating a new situation where light vehicles are being turned into diesel, aggravating this problem. The good news is that in 2014, we were able to introduce green taxes, and we introduced 3 green taxes on CO2, on local pollutants, NOx, PM, and SO2, but also we introduced a tax at the first purchase of cars if they were emitters, and the tax is 10 times higher in a diesel light vehicle than in gasoline. Then we changed a little bit the mistake that we made in 1999.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo. Let's thank our speaker again. So we've heard 2 talks that have focused in on various more concrete and specific examples. In the next 2 talks, we'll be hearing about 2 new reports that will give us a more overarching finance-related perspective. And the first of these reports is one that's being launched this week as well. It's the European Investment Bank's report on SLCPs, and Stefanie Lindenberg from the European Investment Bank will be telling us about this.
Yes. I don't have a PowerPoint.
Okay. Hello, good afternoon. Before I speak about the findings of our report, let me just briefly introduce the organization that I represent here. I represent the European Investment Bank, which is the EU's bank, and our mandate is to support through our financing EU policies. While we are the EU's bank, it is important to know that we not only finance projects within the EU, but also outside of the European Union. In terms of climate finance, we are the biggest multilateral development bank. Last year, we financed 20 billion of climate action around the world. And the reason I'm saying this is not to impress you, but really to raise awareness for an institution that is out there and that is looking to finance climate action projects. We have a target to finance at least 25%. So at least 25% of our lending needs to go to climate action projects. And outside the EU, this target is even higher, at the moment 30%, and it will slowly rise to 35%. So just to give you a bit of background on the organization, on whose behalf I speak. When the EIB, and especially our vice president, heard about the potential of SLCPs and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, he agreed very quickly to join this coalition, which we did in 2014. And as a first step of action, we decided to carry out a stock-taking exercise to see where we could start our action from. And this stock-taking exercise is now finally here in the form of this report on short-lived climate pollutants. And today I would like to share the findings from this report very briefly with you. We went out to explore 3 areas in this report. The first area was that we looked at the standards and criteria that we have in the bank to assess the projects that we want to finance. And we wanted to know whether these standards and criteria actually take SLCPs into account. The second area was that we wanted to know what impact do our projects that we lend to today have on SLCP emissions. And thirdly, of course, we wanted to know how can we step up our efforts to reduce or help reduce SLCPs. So what did we find? Standards and criteria is something that probably sounds quite boring and dry to some of you at first sight. However, to me, and for an institution like the European Investment Bank, it's one of the most important things you can actually look at, because standards and criteria that you set steer the lending of a bank into a certain direction. And here we have a very good news, because we found that most of our standards and criteria already take SLCPs into account today. However, we found one small loophole that we plan to close. We found that in the energy sector, we already take black carbon and PM 2.5 in our cost-benefit analysis of the projects into account. However, an area where we don't do this at present is in the transport sector. And now our transport team, after this analysis, looks into including a cost for PM 2.5 emissions into the CBA for transport projects. The second area, where we looked at what kind of impacts do the projects that we finance have on the emissions of short-lived climate pollutants, we were faced with a surprise, and actually it links quite interestingly into what Roland spoke about today. We saw that we have the biggest impact on reducing short-lived climate pollutants by replacing old leaky gas pipelines. It's something that we didn't expect, but it's the outcome of this report, and I would be interested to hear more about your findings. Then finally, the way forward. While we think that in the energy sector, these investments come very naturally because there's a clear economic case for it, as you said, we think that an area where we probably can and should do more is the waste sector. And now our waste experts, because there are a lot of co-benefits to it, our waste experts look into setting up, hopefully, some kind of facility to finance more waste projects. So coming to a close, I can say that this exercise of the stock-taking exercise was extremely useful for our institution to raise an awareness internally and to find this little loophole, and secondly also to build up a case for further action and to take us forward in this sense. And I think it's also a very helpful exercise to other peer institutions. The World Bank has been, of course, has had a report some years before us, so we followed. And but I can recommend it to other institutions that haven't done it so far very much. Thank you very much. And if anyone is interested in a hard copy, I have some more with me. Otherwise, we have it online. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stefanie. We can also take one question for Stefanie if we have any here. It has to be a quick one and a quick answer. And I'll comment, I'm so pleased to hear about the waste programs and the development of that. I spend quite a bit of time in the Kathmandu Valley which is unbelievably a place that has hardly any waste removal program. And what that implies for air pollution and for ground pollution and water pollution is just tremendous. So are there any questions? Here, Roland.
I'm just curious. Yeah, I was interested in your comment on leaky pipes. How do you know whether they're leaky?
Well, what we do for all our projects that are expected to have a carbon footprint which goes above a certain threshold, well, we look at the carbon footprint and then we do an estimate for what our project compared to what is currently in place will deliver. But it's estimates, it's not direct measurements. And I think that would probably be the next step to take.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you.
So, following on Stefanie's wonderful announcement about the launch of this report, we're going to hear briefly from Stephen Hammer, who's going to tell us about the World Bank's report on the cost of air pollution.
Yes, please. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for the opportunity to join you today. Thanks to the CCAC. I'm presenting a report that was actually released 2 months ago. This was carried out by our environment team. And I think what's relevant here is how this links to our overall approach to climate change, and that we very much approach our work in this space as related to what we can do to achieve good development. You just heard a bit about climate finance tracking, all of the commitments that different multilateral development banks have made to try and increase the percentage of their portfolio that delivers climate co-benefits is the terminology that we tend to use. But what that speaks to is this idea that when we're working with clients, they have concerns about air pollution. They have concerns about lack of water or dirty water. And that in addressing those challenges, we simultaneously have the opportunity to achieve different benefits related to climate change, either on the mitigation or adaptation side. The air quality issue is one that's obviously a much easier sell. We only have to look at the concerns or the pictures that were coming out of Delhi last week. I saw in Mark's first slide that picture of Paris 3 years ago, that this is a problem that plagues many cities, and it's one that concerns local government, it concerns the citizens, it concerns you and me. We have concerns about the impacts on our children, on ourselves. But what we tried to do with this study was to begin to monetize that, quantify it in specific ways so that we can begin to help build the case and again amplify the case for why action is so important. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I do just wanted to highlight some of the key elements of the report. One of the things I should point out, we look a lot at labor impact, labor impacts, welfare impacts. We do not take on healthcare impacts or healthcare costs. And if we had done that, then that would have increased the figures that I'll be presenting even more significantly. There are a few key lessons that we can take away from this analysis. And that one is that despite the fact that we have increased focus on this, despite the fact that we've achieved significant technology gains, this is a problem that's only growing. And it's growing because at the same time we are reducing emissions from different forms of technology, the utilization of that technology is increasing. And so the growth in the total volume of pollutants entering the atmosphere is growing at the same time, and the economic impacts grow as a result as well. So one of the things that we began to do again was to look at the overall impacts, and you begin to see where air pollution fits into the, as a cause of premature deaths globally. Number 4 globally. In developing countries, this is the 3rd leading cause of premature death. we can see with the data that we've compiled that this is, again, a problem that is imposed on many of us, but it is more pervasive in certain parts of the world. The fast-growing developing countries, fast-growing developing country cities of the world in particular are enduring some of the most significant problems. And you can see here how this is changing over just a 13, 15-year period, that the growth in terms of ambient PM 2.5 levels has increased quite significantly in some of the fastest growing urban areas of the world. 93% of all deaths in developing countries are linked to air pollution. Children in low-income countries are 60 times more likely to die from air pollution as children in high-income countries. This is the part that begins to really make the case for where the traction is going to be greatest. You can see the regional differences. This is broken out by World Bank development region, but you can see the total volume of welfare losses, the amount that individuals would be willing to pay to avoid this issue, to avoid these impacts. We were able to quantify that. And you can see that it amounts to a significant proportion of total GDP in different parts of this world, nearly 7.5% in East Asia, 7.4% in South Asia. And that's layered on top of the direct labor losses, which totaled $225 billion in 2013, a 50% increase from what we've seen in 1990. Now, these are losses associated with lost work days, lost productivity associated with the with increased incidence of air pollution. I could go into a lot more detail. We do have in the report, it breaks it out on a country by country basis. We begin to talk about China's 10% GDP loss, India's 7.7 GDP loss, Sri Lanka and Cambodia's 8% GDP loss. This is the beginning of what we see as a very extended work program at the bank. We now have an entire program focused on pollution management and environmental health. We'll be increasingly focusing on addressing that one area where I said we hadn't tackled in this, and that's focus on healthcare implications. This is involving the environment team. This is involving the urban team. We're beginning to develop new methods, new tools that cities can avail themselves of. We'll be launching work, expanding a tool that we've launched at the bank most recently, targeting urban areas. The tool is known as CURB, and this is a scenario planning tool that's primarily linked to energy and climate impacts of different policy interventions at the local and regional level. But we want to be expanding the use of that tool to begin to cover other types of impacts related to air pollution, impacts of different technology interventions as well. So again, this is the folks on the environment team who led the work. I encourage you to reach out directly to them, but I'm happy to talk to you more about it after this panel. And we would welcome collaboration with you on all these issues. So please feel free to approach me afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephen. So as before, we'd have time for one very brief question and a brief answer. Eduardo. Right there.
Health costs in the studies that we have done in Chile for years is very significant. And the important things, and that goes directly to the fiscal budget, because most of this is being paid by the government. Then when there are fiscal constraints, that's a way to convince the Ministry of Finance to act.
So it's not that we were in any way failing to acknowledge that. It was our ability to quantify that at a global level. And so that's where we're going next. All of these things are a data challenge. And so hold on to that idea, come back and let's talk more about that, because that's where we're beginning to aggregate that information now, and hopefully we'll come back and have a better answer next time. Okay. All right.
Thanks again, Stephen. And as they say on Monty Python, and now for something completely different. We have the last 15 minutes, leaving a couple of minutes for closing remarks. that we would like to present to you a pilot auction facility game. Scott Cantor is going to tell you about the game and then give a demonstration of this.
Thanks.
Scott.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to the CCAC, and thanks to the Secretariat, to Tatiana, Helena, and the whole crew for allowing us to give an update on the pilot auction facility for methane and climate change mitigation, something that really took off with a lot of support from partners of the CCAC several years ago. If you don't mind, can we boot up the presentation? Can I also ask for the bidders, we're going to run a little bit of a game, a simulation of this facility and how it works, so you get a little bit of a sense. If I ask the bidders to come up, you know who you are, so please come forward. We're going to play a game. Quick introduction. So. Good. Please come on up. Thanks. Yeah, so just come up. We'll just need well, we're down a chair, so we can stand. Good. Or we can bring another chair. So we're going to play a little bit of a game to sort of demystify what it is that we're doing and how we're financing methane projects at this facility at the World Bank and how we're providing funding. So first, let me just give you a little bit of an overview or an introduction to what this is. So we run auctions to provide funding directly to projects that reduce methane reductions. We do that in the form of carbon credits. Of course, carbon has a CO2 equivalent. We rely on the carbon standards, the CDM and other standards to translate methane into carbon credits. And then we buy carbon credits from projects that reduce methane. We determine the price that we buy the credits, or let's say the amount of funding that goes to these methane reduction projects, by running an auction. We have the projects essentially competing against one another. That way we discover which are the most efficient projects, which ones are the best, and which ones are the ones that we can get the most reductions for the least amount of money. We have run this facility, as I mentioned, with the support and input from many CCAC partners. You see United States, Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland have contributed to funding, $53 million. We've hosted 2 different auctions to date. The price in 2015 and then again in 2016, and we're running another auction in early in next year. The price in the first auction per carbon credit, again, we're buying these carbon credits from these methane projects, was $2.40 US. And in the second auction, it was $3.50. We purchased, or we offered to purchase 8.7 million tons of CO2 equivalent from these methane projects in the first auction and 5.7 million tons in the second. So quite obviously, there's significantly more reductions to be made, but in terms of a pilot and showing the power of these auctions to deliver the funding, a relatively significant amount of reductions achieved. So as I mentioned, the CCAC has been quite an important partner. So how this game is going to work, we are going to have 3 competitors. Each of these competitors, I'm going to give them a bag. If you don't mind just passing along the bag. I have Ben Chi from Nira Economic Consulting. He does the auction management for us. This is mine. This is the money. I am going to be buying. What they are going to be selling. What they are going to be selling are chocolates. So I would ask each of the 3 bidders to open their bag, but not show anybody else what's in their bag. They will see a number of individual chocolate pieces and a little baggie that has 5-cent coins in them. So the game is such. I have $3 here of dimes or US 10-cent pieces. And my objective is to buy as many of their chocolates as I can. And their objective is to sell me the chocolates at the highest possible price. This is how we run the auction, and we discover to find the equilibrium where we get the most number of carbon credits in the case of our auction facility. But here I buy the most number of chocolates from my 3 bidders. So each bidder has to make an independent evaluation of the chocolates. Everybody has a different cost that they ascribe to their chocolate. Some people love chocolate. Some people might have friends that love chocolate. Some people might just be allergic to chocolate or hate chocolate. So everybody has a different cost, and that's what makes the auction competitive. The same way in methane projects. Some methane projects, as we were discussing earlier, are very expensive to tackle. Others are very, very cheap. And our objective as a facility is to discover which ones are really the least cost options. So again, everyone figure out what is the cost that they would think about selling their chocolate. These are dark chocolates, just for everybody in the audience, since you haven't seen them. They're little mini Toblerone bars. And so, you know, people like dark, some people like milk, and so forth. So I'm going to start the bidding at 50 cents. So let me explain. Ben is going to work the PowerPoint for me. We are going to be buying chocolates from the bidders at 50 cents per chocolate, and they are going to indicate to me how many they're willing to sell. Now, it's a good price for them. Let me just steal one of these so you get a sense of what we're talking about. One of these mini Toblerones. If you had those in the audience, you would sell that for 50 cents. You'd feel pretty good about it. You could go down to the cafe and take that money and buy something nicer. So we would expect that at 50 cents, we're going to get a lot of demand. I can only buy 6. I have $3, which means that I can only buy 6. That's the fixed budget divided by the price. If I get collective from these 3 bidders more than 6, I have to lower my price, and auction will continue. So I just need, I should have mentioned that we need a pen, but I have a pencil, and we can share it. Maybe someone else in the audience who has a pen we can borrow very quickly. Thank you to the bidders. So bidders, please indicate to me for 50 cents using your cards for round 1, how many chocolates you're willing to sell. So they know how many chocolates they have, and I am going to be buying them. Lawrence is thinking about it. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So collectively, we have 17 chocolates that have been offered. Again, I could only buy 6, so I can't satisfy them all, the demand of the bidders, and so I reduce the price. My next round, I'm going to say at 30 cents. At 30 cents, I can buy 10 chocolates. Then we'll update the slide. So bidders, if you would tell me for 30 cents, how many of your chocolates are you willing to sell? And I'll collect this. Now, in practicality, the pilot auction facility, we hire Ben from Nira Economic Consulting. He has a team that has an online platform. We have bidders from around the world. Methane projects are bidding in real time from Mexico to Australia, and they're bidding on an online platform, and we're collecting this data. We're not doing it in a room, but just to give you a sense of the mechanics. So in round 2, all right. So we have a total of 14 chocolates. Again, I could buy 10, so we're getting closer, but I still can't satisfy everyone on the stage with their chocolate. So how about 20 cents? 20 cents. How many chocolates do you want to sell me at 20 cents? So we will see. Thank you. Thank you very much. The last bidder. Great. So we have 6 chocolates. So I can sell a grand total of 6 chocolates have been offered to sell. I could buy 15. So I can satisfy the bidders here. And I will now, Ben will help me so I can continue on the presentation. We will exchange the 20 cents for the chocolate. Those have to, so in round 3, bidder A bid 1. So bidder A, that's, you give out 1 chocolate and you get paid 20 cents. And bidder B, you hand over 3 chocolates and you get 60 cents. And bidder C, you give up 2 chocolates and you get 40 cents. So it's a child's game. We want to stress to you how this auction really can deliver maximum funding to projects that reduce short-lived climate pollutants. We've seen this in methane. We've done, as I said, over 11 million tons. We think there's significantly more that can be achieved. We know, as the presentations have suggested, that there are literally thousands of projects that are financeable, and all they need is a little bit of incentive. So I'll ask the bidders just to stay put for a second. I'm just going to finish up, and then we'll turn it back over to Mark. But how is this different, what you saw and what we do at this methane auction? So, of course, the bidders just sold us chocolate. We sell, the bidders in reality in our auction, they sell us these carbon credits, as I mentioned. So the chocolate are the carbon credits. We just paid out, Ben just paid our bidders cash today, but in reality, the way our auction facility works is we don't pay the methane projects until they deliver. They only get paid if they achieve the reductions. They don't get paid immediately upon the auction, they actually get paid later. We have in the pilot auction facility a way to ensure that the prices don't go too low. We know, and we've seen in reverse auctions, there is a problem that prices can get bid down too low if the bidders don't have some of their own money at risk and they aren't incentivized to bid truthfully. So we have methods in place in the pilot auction facility to actually sell the contracts. The bidders just don't get don't just get contracts to sell their chocolates for free. They have to buy them. So this helps us keep the cost in line. And finally, in this auction, all of the bidders had to sell their chocolate to us. But in reality, in our pilot auction facility, it's organized as an optional contract. So those methane projects, if they want to deliver the carbon credits to us in the future, they of course can, and we pay them the 20 cents or the 240 as I mentioned before. But it's an option contract for those that are familiar with the way that these derivative market work. It's a option for the methane project to sell to us, or if they find another buyer with a higher price, that's fine too. What we want to ensure is that the projects happen, that the reductions, that they get the investment and that they are achieved, and that the reductions happen. We don't actually need to take hold of the carbon credits. We just want to see the action happen. So in that way, it is climate finance, and that's why we think it's an effective use of climate finance. So that's a very quick rundown, and thank you very much. I turn it back over to Mark to wrap it up, but thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about our experience.
I have just a quick question. Just one quick question. Can I have a chocolate?
Yeah, these are all your chocolates. They get the chocolates back, and thank our bidders for playing guinea pigs for us today. So thank you.
Also, if we have any questions from the audience, we could take one quick question for Scott. Yes.
Hi, Steve Hammer from the Climate Policy Team at the World Bank. I just wanted to add one team that we didn't probably play up enough. Focus less on the fact that we're talking about chocolate or methane projects, and focus on the idea that this is a platform that can be used on lots of different types of investments. And one of the things that we're consistently trying to do and think about is how we can use alternative financing mechanisms and instruments like this to get money on the table for different types of climate projects. So this is a great innovation in the carbon finance space, but we're also going to be using something like this to begin to think about how we might get money on the table for adaptation projects as well. And this is an example, but we're looking at a wide range of instruments, wide range of mechanisms that are going to help create new markets and hopefully begin to address some of the questions that have been raised via the Paris Agreement about how we're going to get enough money out there in the world for climate finance. So thanks to Scott very much for this.
Thanks again, Scott. I hope you have enjoyed our side event so far. We've gone from the science through the politics, through the opportunities, through the dirty little secrets, through the grand opportunities that we've seen in several cases, and through creative ways of looking at finance. So now coming to a close, we're going to see a video, a Breathe Life video that Helena is going to tell us about, and then Helena is going to give us a few closing words about what we've learned from the CCAC perspective.
Thank you, Mark. And we have another 2.5 minutes before we have to give away the room. So, Nathan, yeah. So, in conclusion, I will quote a few things that you have said. Somebody said, don't wait until you take, don't wait to have all the data before you take action. Somebody said, speed matters and we know what the solutions are. We just have to do it. Somebody said, it takes more action from regulators to scale up. And we heard a lot about finance and how financiers starts to see how it's actually possible to finance. So the Breathe Life campaign that you just saw a snippet of, and you have a website up there, is one means of raising the awareness and reaching policymakers locally and also nationally with the solutions. And since we are here to talk about actions on near-term climate mitigation to protect air quality and achieve the Paris Agreement, we think that all of us in this room become now multipliers also out there in the Paris Agreement corridors, because I heard somebody say as well that maybe it's not going quick enough out there in the real kind of conference world, but out there in the real street world and where the policymaker sits in California or in Chile or in Santiago or in Delhi, they are actually very concerned about children's life. So it's a call to all of us, and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, we had our high-level assembly with the ministers 2 days ago, adopting a communique in which for the first time we start to actually commit ourselves to do certain actions by next year. And there were 3 actions this time. So one was on diesel and how to introduce low sulfur diesel and cleaner vehicles. And I heard several of you actually speak about this issue of clean diesel. So there will be, we have a strategy, a global strategy to introduce low sulfur diesel, and we have a mechanism that will help countries to achieve that, even though less than 9% of the NDCs include transport and less than 3% include green freight in their commitments. So let us make that more high on the agenda. We also agreed to do black carbon inventories or start to do them during next year. And little by little, this can become a metrics that goes beyond let's say the voluntary commitments that we have in our coalition, and maybe also push it forward into other more strongly firm commitments as well. And the third one is on methane from oil and gas industry and how countries and regulators need to speed up and also create strategies to that extent. So I'm not going to talk anymore, but I just want to thank everybody, the moderator, Mark Lawrence, all the fantastic speakers, the chocolate givers and the financiers, and the great experience from Chile and CORFO, which shows us that this is not just the international banks who has to step up, it's also the national governments, the national financial institutions, and in the end also the entrepreneurs and the companies who produce the electricity, who produce the energy, the copper or whatever it is. Reducing short-lived climate pollutants is a must. Speed up action. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Helena, and thanks to all of our speakers for staying very well in time. Thanks to our gamers at the end. Thanks to our participants, and thanks to all of you for participating, and good luck on your way.
I had one more point I forgot. If you wonder why I was sitting there sometimes on the side, it's because yesterday was the Gender Day and today is the Women Leaders Summit happening. And one issue that has been brought to everybody's attention is that there is a lot of guys in black suits talking about these issues, while actually much of the leadership comes also from the women in this room and this world. So, you know, we wanted to have some gender balance, even if it's optical. So go think about that. And in the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, somebody congratulated us, not for the communique, but because our panel was 85% women. So anyhow, what can I say? Lots of ministers.
Absolutely. Thanks, Helena. What a wonderful point to end on. So all of you, a great time.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you. That was great.
So we had you should give them back their game cards.
Yes. Game cards and diamonds and coins.